We continue now at the top of Daf Nun Dalet and Beis and Meseches Menachos. This is Menachos Daf 54b. On the previous Amud, the Gemara brought a machlokas amoraim between Rav and Shmuel with regards to a piece of meat that the size of the volume changes. Either it becomes larger or it becomes smaller. Rav says we follow the volume it is right now. If, for example, it's a kibetza right now, so then it's able to convey tumah. If it's less than a kibetza, it's not able to convey tumah. That's what Rav says. But Shmuel says, no, we follow the original volume. We don't follow the volume that it is presently. But the Gemara in the previous summit asked against Shmuel from various sources, and the Gemara ended up saying that actually that's not the machlokas Rav and Shmuel at all. Rather, everybody agrees. Let's say you have a situation where it starts out at a sufficient volume, but then it gets smaller. We follow what it is right now. Right now it's too small to convey tumah, so it does not convey the tumah. And everybody also agrees, let's say it starts out at a volume that is too small to convey tumah, but then it swells, so then we say it's going to convey tumah only at the derabanan level in such a situation. And what is the machlokas Rav and Shmuel? The machlokas is as follows. Ki pligi, when do they argue? Kagon shahaya bo kashir, for example, let's say it started out at the right shear, at the right measurement, at the right volume, v'tzamak, and then it shrunk, v'chazer v'tafach, and then it went and swelled back again to the original shear. That actually is the machlokas between Rav and Shmuel. The Mar Savar yesh dichoy be'isura, one holds that by Isser we say something gets pushed off, since at one point in time it shrunk, it was no longer the proper shear, so it's pushed off, it's not considered to be the proper shear. Umar Savar, and the other one holds, ein dichoy be'isura, there is no dichoy when it comes to Isser. And Rashi explains, Ki pligi v'sar ha'egel shenitzbach, this is going on the Mishnah and Uksin that started this entire sugya. The Mishnah and Uksin talks about a case of besar ha'egel shenitzbach, that is the meat of a calf that it swells up, and then it talks about the besar zekena, the meat of the older animal that shrinks, but now we're saying it's really all one case. Uvesar ha'egel shenitzbach ha'seifa koi, when we say besar ha'egel shenitzbach, that's just what happens at the end. It swells back up to its original size. Shechazer l'chamos shahaya, it returns to its original size. And besar zakena shenismait, when the Mishnah mentions besar zakena shenismait, that it gets smaller, amitzei koi, that's going in the middle stage, where again it starts at the right size, and then in the middle stage it shrinks down and it's less than the right volume. V'hachi kamar, and this is what the Mishnah is saying, afagav shenismait keshir sheyesh bo achshav misharinan hoel uchvar hava behenami hai shiur. Again, even though it shrunk in the middle, but since it returned to the original state, so therefore we say umechayev midoraisa, we say it's chayev doraisa. V'lo amrinan, we don't say b'shosh et samko, that at the time that it shrunk nidchu meisurayu, it's pushed off from its isser. V'havale kamisha lo hayabo mitchilan, it's like it wasn't the right size from the beginning. V'hashta isu pater midoraisa, in which case we would say pater on a doraisa level. Again, that would be the approach of Rav. For Rabbi Shimon Reish Lakish Savri, Rabbi Shimon and Reish Lakish, they hold, Rabbi Shimon Reish Lakish is the same as Shmuel, they hold yesh dichoy b'isur, and they hold that it gets pushed, that there is a concept of being pushed off by Isser. V'kevon di idchi, once it gets pushed off, it's pushed off. V'lo yekavelo tumah midoraisa ela midrabanan. At that point, it's not going to receive tumah doraisa level, it's just going to be derabanan. But the Gemara continues and asks, does anyone really hold there's a concept of dichoy, that it gets pushed off by Isur? And again, essentially, this is going to be a question against Shmuel and Rabbi Shimon and Reish Lakish, who hold yesh dichoy. But we learned in a Mishnah, this is a Mishnah in Meseches Taharos, kibetza ochlen shehinicha b'cham, if there's a kibetza of food and it's left in the sun, v'nismatu, it becomes smaller. V'chein kazayis min hameis, and also let's say there's a kazayis from a dead body, kazayis min hanevela, or kazayis from a nevela, a dead animal, chadosha min hasheretz, or a lentil size from a sheretz, which is a creepy crawly creature, uchazayis pigel, or you have a kazayis of pigel, ukazayis noser, or a kazayis of noser, ukazayis chaylev, or a kazayis of chaylev, non-kosher fat. Tahor, and in all of these situations we're going to say tahor, we say that it's pure, ve'ein chayavin aleim, and there's no liability, misham pigel, v'noser, v'chaylev, there's no liability in terms of pigel, noser, and chaylev. Hinichon b'geshamim v'tafchu, now if they're left in the rain and they swell up, so then tamei, and then they're going to be tamei, and then there's going to be a liability in terms of pigel, noser, and chaylev. And Rashi explains, Tahorin, when it says in this Mishnah they're pure, Kaya ochlin umesun avela v'sheretz, that's going on the cases of food, and the dead body, the nevel and the sheretz, those are tahor, again because they shrink, they're smaller than the necessary size. And also vein chayavin Kaya noser pigel v'chaylev, that's going on noser, pigel, and chaylev. Now hinichon b'geshamim la'elu atzman la'achar shetzamku, the understanding of this Mishnah is, let's say these very same items which shrunk, now they're put into the rain and they swell back up, so essentially exactly the case that we said there's a machlokas amoroim, and so in that case, what does it say? It says chayavin aleya misham pigel noser v'chaylev, and it says that they're tamei, and so therefore it seems clear to yufta l'madamer yesh dichoy b'isurin. Let us say that this is a refutation according to the one who says that there is dichoy, that isurin do get pushed off, and the Gemara says to yufta, indeed it is a refutation. And the Gemara now continues and returns to Rabba's understanding of the machlokas amoroim. Again, Rabba understands that all amoroim fundamentally agree that we follow the volume as it is right now, not the volume as it used to be. And so the Gemara says, Tashma, come in here a proof from the following Brisa, Tormin te'enim al hagrogros b'minyan. The Rashi says this tormin does not mean take off truma, but it means taking off meiser, which is 1/10. When we're taking off 1/10, when we're taking off meiser, if we're doing te'enim, fresh figs, on grogros, which are dried figs, so fresh figs have a greater volume, but you don't separate that 1/10 based on volume, you do it by minion, you do it by number. So for example, 10 fresh figs for 100, let's say you have 100 dried figs, it's going to be 10 by number of figs. And what's going to end up happening in that situation is, if you calculate based on volume, you will actually have more than 1/10 that has been separated as meiser. That's what the Bryce is essentially saying. You should do it in a generous fashion. You should separate 1/10 based on number, and then you'll have more than 1/10 if you calculate based on volume. And the Gemara says, now, and if you're going to say that we go by what the volume used to be, so then Shapir, this works out fine, because the volume of the grogros used to be a greater volume, because they used to be fresh figs, and when they were fresh, they had the same volume as the te'enim, because they were te'enim. And so then you're actually taking off exactly 1/10 based on volume as well, if we're going on what the volume used to be. So that's fine. Eloi Amrit Kimos Shahain, but if you're going to say that we do it as it is right now, so you're really taking off too much meiser, Havale Marbe b'meisros, you're taking off too much meiser in terms of volume. V'tanyan, we learned in a Brisa, Hamarbe b'meisros, if somebody takes off too much meiser, so peirosa mesukanim, so the produce is fixed fine. There's nothing wrong in terms of the produce that's being fixed by taking this meiser. That's all been fixed. You took more than you needed. However, umaisrosa of mikulkalin, but the meiser itself, that actually is actually ruined, because now you've taken off too much. You have too much meiser over here. It doesn't all have a status of meiser. It essentially is a mixture of meiser and non-meiser, because you can't take off more than 1/10. You're not supposed to take off more than 1/10. And so therefore, what's going on in this brisa, that the brisa is saying that you should do it b'minyan, and what's fundamentally happening is, if we go by volume, you've taken off more than 1/10. But the Gemara continues and says, Elamai, but what's the alternative? How else are we going to learn this brisa? L'chemos shehain, you're going to say it's l'chemos shehain, that we go by what the volume used to be. But then we have a problem with the end of the brisa. Amos Seifa, look at the end of the brisa. Grogros ala te'enim, let's say you take off from the dried figs on the fresh figs, so then you obviously can't do it by the number of figs, because that would be, if you're going to do it by the number, the volume is going to be too little, because grogros have less volume than te'enim. So b'mida, then you have to do it by measure, you have to do it by volume in that situation. Now, in this situation, if you're going to go by what the volume is right now, so then shapir, so then it's going to make sense. In other words, in a situation of grogros on te'enim, follow volume, follow the present volume. That all makes sense. But if you're going to say we go by what the volume used to be, so we view the grogros as if they are te'enim, so again you're going to be marbe b'meiser, so again that's going to be too much meiser, because that's going to be a much greater volume. Now we're looking at the grogros as if they were te'enim, so we're increasing the volume of the meiser. And so clearly whatever is happening in this brisa, the whole point of the brisa is that you should always separate in the most generous manner. So in a situation where the number of items is the most generous, do it that way. In a situation where the volume is the most generous, you do it that way. But then we're back to the problem that isn't there a problem of marbe b'maestro? So clearly we're not talking about regular maestro over here. That has to be the answer. That's why this brisa is not relevant to Rabbah. Elohacha b'truma gedola askin, and rather you have to say over here we're talking about truma gedola, regular truma. Now by regular truma there's no set amount. You could do it in a generous fashion, you could do it in a regular fashion, etc. And so therefore v'reisha be'ein yafe v'seifa be'ein yafe, and the beginning of the brisa is talking about saying do it as generous as possible, and the end is also saying to do it as generous as possible. That's what the brisa is actually talking about. But the Gemara continues and asks, if so, if we're going to say that this brisa, again, is talking about Truma Gedola, but Ema Seifa, look at the end of this brisa. Amar Rabbi Elazar Rabbi Yossi says, Abba hayanotel eser grogros shebimiksoa, father would take 10 dried figs in the miksoa, which was a tool that was working with the figs, al tishim shebakalkola, on the 90 that were in the basket. So he used to take, again, 10 for the 90, and this is talking, it seems to be talking about some kind of meiser. Why would it be 10 for 90? Otherwise, it seems to be 10 out of 100. If we're talking about Truma Gedola, Eser Mayavidite, what is the number 10 doing over here? In other words, just from the number 10 at the end of the brisa, it does seem like we're talking about Meiser. And so the Gemara instead says, Elahacha, rather over here, we're not talking about Meiser, and we're not talking about Truma Gedola. Rather, Betrumas Meiser Askin, and we're talking about Trumas Meiser. Trumas Meiser is after Meiser is given to the Levi. The Levi then separates 1/10 of that Meiser and gives it to the Kohen. That's called Trumas Meiser, and that is 1/10. And as we're going to go on to say, when it comes to Trumas Meiser, there is a concept that it can be done generously, because we're following Abba Elazar ben Gomel. The Abba Elazar ben Gomel, who this is Abba Elazar ben Gomel. The Tanya, as we learned in a Braisa, Abba Elazar ben Gomel Omer, Abba Elazar ben Gomel says, V'nechshav lechem trumaschem, it says your truma in plural, B'shtei trumos hakosam medaber. We're talking about 2 trumos. Achas Truma Gedola, one is Truma Gedola, that's the regular truma. V'achas Trumas Meiser, and the other is Trumas Meiser. Kashem shetruma Gedola, and we compare the two. Kashem shetruma Gedola nitelas ba'omed uv'machshava, just like Truma Gedola can be taken ba'omed, which means by estimate, and b'machshava, which means through machshava, through thought. Kach Trumas Meiser nitelas ba'omed, so too Trumas Meiser, it also can be taken by estimate. And we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Nun Hey Amud Aleph.